Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about issues that involve emergency situations with our youth. These can be really tough because we all come into this work really wanting to help, but at the end of the day, sometimes our kids are put in dangerous situations, either by their choice or by the situation, that we have to know how to handle. What we're going to talk about today are emergency crisis incidents and emergency safety interventions. And these are two things that are closely monitored by the state of Utah and need to be handled with extreme professionalism and care so that we can make sure that we do the very best we can for our kids. It will happen oftentimes when youth are in emotional situations that they won't make the best choices. And typically that's where we have to report an incident. It's nothing to be afraid of, it's nothing to be scared about, but we do need to make sure that we handle them professionally, hence the reason why we have this class. If you look at your first slide, behavioral interventions essentially involve 4 levels of intervention. The first are behavioral interventions, and those are the things that we call teaching. Preventive teaching, corrective teaching, and intensive teaching are all considered behavioral interventions. They're the ways that we talk to the kids to try to help them calm down, to help them kind of think through situations and help them make good choices. The second level is timeout or calming time. And those are often used when a youth is in an emotional situation where they can't really think about what the best choice is. If you have a young child who's tantruming, who's kicking, maybe throwing toys around, that would be a really good time to use either time out, time in, or calming time. You'll learn more about those things, those interventions later. But just so that you know, when your regular teaching isn't working, it's often time to bring in some of those coping strategies or calming techniques into your regular teaching. The next level is a passive physical restraint. Restraints are used very, very rarely and only under 3 circumstances. If you'll notice the very last bullet on our slide, it talks about the situations where we would restrain a child. If they were a danger to others, if they're a danger to themselves, or if there's a credible threat of abuse to self or others. One of the things I really want to highlight here, you guys, is that in these really emotionally charged moments, it's very important that you are in contact with your consultant. I always get a little bit apprehensive when we start to talk about these things that are more emotionally charged because people often feel like they have to know all the answers and the exact right thing to do in any given moment. And that's just absolutely not true. Your consultant or someone like myself is just a phone call away. So if you are ever in an emotional situation where either you're starting to become emotional or the child is starting to become emotional and you don't know what to do, that's when you kind of literally freeze whatever you're doing and get somebody on the phone that can help you work through and help the child work through whatever is happening at the time. It can be really scary the first several times that these emotional situations happen. It sounds silly that this slide, I'm hoping this slide will help you, but I really am, because one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that no matter what is going on in your home, there will always be a next step. There will be something else you can do, someone else you can contact, or another intervention you can put in place so that you don't ever lose emotional control of a situation. So that's really our intent in talking about emergency safety interventions and emergency crisis incidents. This exceptionally wordy slide is just our restraint training protocol. You will be given this, and this will be gone over in detail by your consultant. So feel free to read this document, but you will actually get this in training one-on-one with your consultant. So not to worry, again, don't worry about it too much. It's just something that you're going to be trained on and that we want you to be aware of for future reference. What are behavioral interventions? Up to this point, I've been calling those teaching interactions, and that's actually what they are. The purpose that they serve is to really intervene in the youth's behavior, whether that behavior is positive or whether that behavior needs correction, to teach the child a different way to behave. The first one we use is called preventive teaching. Again, I've talked about this quite a bit before, and that is essentially the teaching that we do in the absence of any behavior. So if you've got a youth who is really nervous about the prospect of going to school, then you will use preventive teaching to kind of practice with them the different kinds of things that they need to do when they go to school that will help them feel more comfortable. Corrective teaching is the teaching that we use when there has been a negative behavior that needs to be corrected. Our teaching interactions are the classes that you will come to Utah Youth Village. We will practice those, we will learn those. You will get a lot of support practice in how to do that. From this perspective for this class, we're just talking about this conceptually. Once a youth has decided that they're not going to do what you ask them to do or calm themselves down in an effective way, that's when we move to intensive teaching. And it's most likely that you are going to have to use an incident report or crisis interventions when you're in the intensive teaching phase of teaching. Once a youth is kind of emotionally not able to control their own behavior, we move into giving them a lot of time. It's really hard when you've got little ones that need to get to school, or dinner that needs to get on the table, or other appointments or things that need to be done. Inevitably, that's when our youth decide that they're not going to listen to you, right? If anyone has kids or has been around kids, they are uncanny in their timing for knowing when you don't have time and then needing to take your time. When we're in a behavioral intervention that is intensive, we give them time whether we have it or not. And the most effective way, essentially, to intervene as far as time is concerned, is you act like the only thing you have to do all day is to help them calm down. If you start to get antsy and frustrated, if you start to look at your watch and act like time's an issue, then they will react to that negatively, and normally it will take more time than it would if you just maintained your composure and stayed really calm and patient. Time can be a trigger for parents, but it's also a very effective teaching tool. So let time be your friend when you're using behavioral interventions. The next thing we do is allow for a lot of choices. The timing of things, which coping strategy they want to use. For example, if I ask a youth, do you want to journal or would you rather draw? Would you like a fidget spinner or would you like a squeezy ball? Giving them choices as far as what coping strategy they want to use can also be very effective. Anything that will help calm them. If they have any experience with using mindfulness or deep breathing, counting, all of those things are used to calm the child when they are in an intensive situation. Helping to redirect them. If you are in a situation where you have to physically guide a youth to a bedroom or to a chair, then that requires that you are trained in restraints, which in Utah Youth Village we use handle with care. Again, something we will go into more detail a little bit later. Following any kind of intensive situation, we will always use reparative teaching, including praise and empathy. If chairs have been knocked over or if things have been thrown, we always go back with the youth and help them pick up the chairs and help them pick up papers or other items that might have been thrown while they were struggling. And the reason we do that is to help them really understand that they haven't damaged their relationship with us, which is easier said than done, right? When kids are tantruming, for lack of a better word, it's really easy to have them draw us in emotionally to the behaviors that they're choosing to engage in. When everything's calm, when they are back under control emotionally, it's really important that they understand that our relationship's okay. You and I are okay, bud. We got through that. That was really emotionally hard for both of us. You probably made some choices that weren't the greatest. And guess what? I still like you. I still think you're awesome. And I still know that you can do the things that you need to do to get better. That's really the overall message that we're trying to send to kids when they've been in an intensive situation. Timeout is typically done in a common area of the home where they can be supervised. Oftentimes, parents think of time out as having kids go to a corner or go to their room or go to another area where the child is away from the family and away from, other siblings and things like that. Another way to look at that is called time in. If you have a child sit in a time in, it's really a way that you can be with them, be that calming kind of presence. If they're really upset, I wouldn't advise that you sit too close to them, but just being in the same general area, having you calmly read a book or listen to music or play a card game, anything that will be that good positive role modeling they need for what to do when they're feeling emotionally stressed. Often called a timeout, but from our perspective, we call it a time in because we're not isolating them or keeping them away from the family in any way. We're being there as an emotional resource for them so that they can calm themselves down. When we do that, it's really important, either a timeout or a time in, it's really important to never create a barrier between the youth leaving an area. If you stand in a doorway, for example, or if a youth is sitting in the corner on a kitchen table and the only way they can leave is to walk by you, you're actually putting yourself at risk for being harmed. However unintentional, you have to remember that in these highly emotional situations, this part of their brain, this kind of animal survival part of their brain, is the only part that's working, right? So that fight or flight or freeze mechanism gets kicked in. And if they want to flee and you're in their way, that's survival for them. And I honestly can't stress enough how the part of their brain that's thinking about consequences is not working. The part of their brain that might worry that they really don't want to hurt you or that they don't want the consequences of hurting you is not working. They only know that they have an overwhelming sense that they have got to get out of that situation and they've got to do it now. So we never create a barrier for them in escaping a situation that they're perceiving as dangerous. Whether that is real or imagined or perceived, they feel like their life is in danger in that moment. So we never block them from leaving a situation where they might feel that they're in danger. The child in your home does do better with a little bit of space, maybe not having you be so close, but having them sit somewhere that's a little bit farther away, making sure that you're monitoring them so that they're not breaking anything, that they're not breaking their toys, that they're not digging a hole in your wall, because again, they sometimes use really unhealthy coping strategies in times when they're kind of emotionally flooded. As I sort of alluded to before, we never use seclusion with our youth. If they want to be in their room, with very rare exceptions, think that's a pretty bad idea because one, they're not with the people that are going to be able to help them calm down. Two, they can use it to isolate and further alienate themselves from their connection to your family, which is also not healthy. We all need some time alone, and that's not what I'm talking about. But if you're telling a child to go to their room, if you're telling them to get away from you, to go away, that is a very rejecting stance to take with them and really makes it so your relationship with them is going to be harder, not only for them, but also for you. Now we're going to talk about restraints. In foster care, we very, very, very rarely ever use a passive physical restraint with a child, but it's important that you know the circumstances and situations where that would be acceptable. Most important thing that you need to know about restraints is that you must never engage in a restraint if you are not trained to do so. And in addition to that, that we will use every possible intervention of before and ahead of and in place of ever putting our hands on a child. When we say restraint, oftentimes, depending on your background, people think of kind of a takedown, right? Like the police might take down somebody and think, oh, I would never do that to a child. I would never jump on a kid or, force them into a situation. In our world, in the foster care world, a restraint really is any time that you put your hands on a child to control their actions. And that includes walking a 2-year-old to a chair, to a timeout. If it's done to control their action, and especially when it's done in a form of discipline, then that's considered a restraint. So if you have a 2-year-old and you're lifting them up to put them in a high chair to eat, not a restraint. If you are taking their shoulders to guide them to timeout, that is actually considered a restraint. So if you are working with young children, you will be trained in restraint, because even if you grab their arm to stop them from walking out into the road and getting hit by a car, the legal definition or the state's definition of that is that it is a restraint. I know that sounds a little bit extreme, but it is important to remember that these are our most vulnerable children. These are kids that are more likely to be victimized. They're more likely to be abused. They're more likely to be harmed just because of where they come from. The state's intention is to make sure that those kids are protected to the very best of their ability. Unfortunately, we've all heard horrible nightmare stories of kids who were abused in foster care. And our goal, the state of Utah's goal and Utah Youth Village's goal, is that that never happens on our watch. So we take these rules very seriously, we monitor them very closely, and we give you the absolute best training so that we can support and advocate for you in situations where you have had to, under necessary circumstances, put your hands on a child. I do want to stop right here for a minute and just talk a little bit about CPS. There are some people, and this is not part of the slide presentation, so I hope you're not looking for it, say, oh, don't do foster care, or have heard, oh, don't do foster care because then you'll have a CPS investigation. People will call CPS and report child abuse. And if you've never heard of this, I apologize. It's actually something that is quite common in concerns that people have about doing foster care, so I just want to cover this very briefly. Child Protective Services is nothing to be afraid of. There are a few children in the system that have learned, oh, if I say CPS or if I threaten an investigation or if I call, then they'll move me or my caseworker will listen to me. And there's all of these, for lack of a better word, there's this misinformation within the system, unfortunately, about Child Protective Services and what happens if somebody calls on you. We advocate for support and protect our foster parents. As long as you're not doing anything wrong and you have followed our training, there shouldn't be any reason that you should need to worry about a CPS investigation. And frankly, if you do foster care, there is a chance that there might be a CPS investigation, but that doesn't mean that it will be founded, that anything will happen to you, that anything negative will come of it. You just have to be prepared to answer the questions of any investigator that might ask you questions, and to the best of your ability, in all cases, protect youth rights. I bring this up in relation to restraint because there's a higher likelihood that those situations will be investigated, and actually that's one of the reasons why we do them so infrequently, because you are just more likely to hurt a child on accident if you try to restrain them. Those two things, unfortunately, kind of get paired together because they are more often investigated if a restraint has been involved. So I apologize for the little caveat. I hope I didn't scare anybody. If anyone is concerned about it, please talk to your consultant, or as always, you're always welcome to call me or email me any concerns that you have about child protective services or restraints. I'm always happy to answer any of those questions. So moving on, as I kind of mentioned, we always will try verbal de-escalation and every other tactic we can: calming, timeout, journaling, coping, mindfulness. We've got laundry lists of things that we do with our kids before we would ever restrain them. Never would restrain a child to cause them pain or discomfort or to punish them in any way. I know it sounds crazy when you're not in the moment, but sometimes when you're feeling emotionally drained and you just want them to behave. There have been a few situations where kids have been put in a restraint or in a hold, and they really didn't need to be put there. It was just a parent's desperation to try to get control of a situation that they were feeling out of control in. It is in any way possible to contact your supervisor or consultant before a restraint. That should always be done. If you have a feeling that a youth is just going to have a really hard day, I would get your consultant on the phone immediately so that they can prevent a restraint and guide you through the verbal de-escalation that we use. We would only ever continue a restraint for as long as the child is a threat to themselves or others. And it will never be used as a punishment, as I already said. If you are in a situation where you feel like you may need to restrain a child and you're not trained, my advice would be to call 911, because they are trained to control your child, to control a person, and the risk of them hurting them is actually less than the risk of you hurting them if you have not been trained in how to restrain them. This is the link to our incident reporting reference guide. You will go through this in detail with your consultant. So again, if you'd like to click on the link, you're welcome to. If you want to just wait to review that with your consultant, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, so there are two levels of severity in incident reporting. So we were just talking about behavioral interventions, and sort of the highest level of behavioral intervention is a restraint. After anything that involves a severe behavior happens, you will most likely need to write an incident report. So we're talking now about incident reporting and incident report guidelines. The two levels of severity that we're going to talk about are critical incidents and non-critical incidents. And the person that you need to notify is based on the level of severity. If it's a non-critical incident, you will most likely only need to let your supervisor know, and then the caseworker needs to know. If it's a critical incident, then we also have to inform the division director, and that has to be reported to the Office of Licensing. Again, these are all tiny, tiny little details that you don't need to remember at this point. It's just important to remember the two types of incidents, critical and non-critical, and that there are different reporting requirements based on those two kinds of incidents. So the categories for critical incidents are abuse, neglect, exploitation, unexpected death, client injury, criminal activity, unauthorized alcohol or substances, dangerous weapons, an attempted suicide, any sexual misconduct, a client right violation, or a medication error with impact to the client's health or well-being, unauthorized client departure, contagious illness outbreak, or a facility or environment issue. Because you're in foster care and you don't have a facility or environmental issue, unless there was like a toxic waste spill near your home, you wouldn't need to worry about that one in terms of those being critical incidents. The next level are non-critical incidents. Those are an unexpected admission to the hospital, destruction of property over $500, suicidal ideation or threats of suicide, aspiration of choking with no hospitalization, evidence of seizure, fraud or abuse of Medicaid funds. Again, this is one that's required to report, but you will most likely never have any reason to report anything that has anything to do with Medicaid. It's just one of the ones that's on the list, so never fear about that one. Involvement with law enforcement, paramedics, or fire department, pornography, or any pending litigation. So if somebody is suing somebody, then we need to report that to the caseworker. I'm going to have you practice, and these are actually very tricky, so we'll actually just go through each one, and then you'll have time to discuss with your consultant on a deeper level kind of what these mean. So as I mentioned before, handle with care is the technique we use for physical restraint. So anytime we use a restraint, that would be considered a critical incident. Anytime we physically put our hands on a child to control their movement, that would be considered a restraint using handle with care. So that would be critical. If there's an adult medication error, if you look back at your list, then a medication error, regardless of whether it was an adult or a child, if it affects their health and safety, would be considered a critical incident. If it doesn't affect their health and safety, then it would be considered a non-critical incident. So an example of that would be if an adult failed to give a child a melatonin before they went to bed, but typically they do give the child a melatonin before they go to bed, but there's no risk to their health or safety just because they didn't get a melatonin, which is a natural substance, then that would be considered a non-critical incident. If it was a psychotropic medication, on the other hand, led to some kind of an emotional outburst or the child's inability to control themselves, then that would affect their health and safety and would be a critical incident. It often happens when we talk about walkabouts that people think, are we in Australia? Why are we talking about a walkabout? Because that's the common understanding of what a walkabout is. A child has an unauthorized departure from their residence. That would be considered an AWOL or a runaway or potentially a walkabout. It doesn't really differentiate in the guideline, which is why we put this on to practice. If the child goes on a walkabout and you can still see them, or if you're kind of following behind them and are shadowing them, then they're considered to still be in your custody even though they've left the home. If you can't see them and you don't know where they've gone, then that would be considered a runaway or an unauthorized departure, and that would be considered a critical incident. And you will always have the guidance and support of your consultant when you're kind of making these decisions about what kind of an incident this is or isn't. The same example, if a youth refuses the medication, if it doesn't harm them in any way, then it would be a non-critical. If it's a necessary psychotropic medication, it would be considered a critical incident. A uni hospitalization. So uni is the University of Utah's mental health facility. Depending on whether if an unexpected hospitalization is considered a non-critical incident actually, but if it involves the police or paramedics or first responders, then it's actually considered a critical incident. So it would depend on how that child got to the University of Utah to be put inpatient at the hospital. Brings home the point that you're going to want to talk to your consultant anytime anything remotely related to this happens, so that they can give you the support you need to make sure that when you write an incident report or report an incident, you're doing it in the way that is expected. A couple of specific guidelines for incident reporting. Anything involving handle with care, which is a restraint, would have to be reported as soon as possible and no longer than an hour to a supervisor. Any description of any of the interventions used prior to the restraint must be described. Any behavior that necessitates the restraint needs to be described. How often is this child being restrained? How intensive are their behaviors? This is important for us in terms of treatment planning. It's possible that you have a child that is not at the appropriate level of care. They might need a group home, or they might need to go to the hospital for a short period of time. Depending on how often this child is needing to be restrained, if they really do need to be restrained, or maybe, we as humans, because we make mistakes, maybe we're jumping the gun in restraining them before they really need it. These are all questions that we've got to answer. And then, of course, if there's any injury, even if it's slight, that has to be part of the incident report. Other incidents, we just follow the JJS, or DHS, guidelines. If are required to contact a person in person and are not able to get a hold of the caseworker or their supervisor, then we call this statewide child abuse reporting hotline, which is the 800 number at the bottom of the slide. If there's an emergency behavioral intervention, then we need to contact the caseworker within 24 hours and complete the incident report. Also, we'll do a post-intervention debriefing, and that allows us to sort of just flesh out all of those things that we were talking about. Did we jump the gun? Did the child really need it? How intensive were the behaviors? How often are they happening? All of these things are discussed at the time of the post-intervention conference. If a restraint happens more than 2 times in 30 days, then the village will convene a behavioral management review committee just to make sure that those were absolutely necessary and to see if anything else needs to be happening in that child's treatment. The things that we never allow at Utah Youth Village are coercive therapeutic techniques, which are, I'll feed you if you do what I say. If you calm down, then you get to have dinner. If you don't calm down, then you don't get to eat. That's coercion. And it's abusive. It's a violation of youth rights. We would never do that. Instructing others to use coercive therapeutic techniques. If you advise a youth, hey, if he's punching you, punch him back. Or if you talk to a therapist and say something like, use an unethical form of therapy on this child, that would never be allowed and it would never be condoned by Utah Youth Village. We also follow all mandatory reporting laws. So if you see a child being abused, whether they're a child in your care or not, as somebody who contracts with Utah Youth Village, you are a mandatory reporter. Everyone that works for Utah Youth Village is a mandatory reporter. So if a child reports to us that their parents aren't feeding them, or they are abusing them, if they're hurting them, if they're locking them out of the house, then we have an obligation to report that to Child Protective Service, and we take that responsibility very seriously. Again, I kind of want to emphasize that Child Protective Services isn't anything to be afraid of if we have done nothing wrong. If you do make a mistake, let's say that you lose your temper and call a child a bad name. We're human, things happen. The best course of action is just to immediately report that to your consultant so that they can give you additional support and training on how to handle that. And then we can write the incident report, discuss it with the caseworker, and move on. Right? Because none of us are perfect. We are all human. We just want to make sure that you never get to that breaking point where you violate youth rights in a way that is damaging to them and in a way that cannot be repaired. By following Utah Youth Village Restraint Protocol, we protect the children that we serve from being re-traumatized or from contributing to any harm to them in any way. And that's how we protect our kids and use trauma-informed care with them, really by doing everything in our power not to harm them or re-traumatize them if we can absolutely help it, which is why we work very hard to never use restraints with our kids, because even if you do it perfectly, even if you do it under all of the right circumstances and with the best of intentions, it is damaging to your relationship with the child. Almost always ends up with the necessity of having to repair that relationship in some way. I want to thank you for sitting with me today. I know this was a really heavy, hard topic. It's one that we have to make sure that you understand and are trained on. If it's given you any fears or worries about doing foster care or really anything, if there's anything that you need to reach out to your consultant and talk to them about, I would encourage you to do so. The intention of this class is not to be hard or scary or to scare you away from this wonderful work, but just make sure you're completely informed about the best way to care for your kids. I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.